If that regime falls, it would be a disaster for Putin. If you look at all of his friends and alliances over the last couple of years, you can cross off Assad, you can cross off Maduro. If you cross off Ayatollah, he's looking pretty much on his own. Russia would lose a huge amount of influence and access. Iran is huge. It also gives them access to the Gulf, where they can have ships operating. They would lose that. If you look at a map, the Russians can go straight through Iran right down to the Persian Gulf. He's probably sending weapons, whatever they have left, to Iran right now to try and suppress these protesters. I don't think it's going to work. I think that regime probably will fall.
Russia is desperately trying to save its shadow fleet. As U.S. forces begin seizing sanctioned oil tankers, Moscow is rushing to reflag vessels under the Russian tricolor, hoping its flag will provide protection. So far, it hasn't worked. Tankers are still being stopped, boarded, and declared stateless. And the sea is becoming a new front line in this war. To understand what's happening, I'm joined by Caolan, Robertson, an Irish journalist. So, Caolan, the United States has detained for the last months, 5 Russian oil tankers connected to the shadow fleet. And that's just the drop in the ocean, because according to The Guardian, around 1,400 vessels connected to the shadow fleet right now, somewhere when we're talking to you, worldwide in the sea and in the oceans. So, the problem is that the oil is still selling and the money is still flowing to fund the war against Ukraine. But what has changed in all the situation, that this question and the vessels are not being ignored anymore. And you by yourself were trying to figure out in that issue and problem. And you by yourself went to Greece, to the Lesbos Island, to make a documentary and try to understand how the Russian shadow fleet is functioning and who is helping to operate it. So my first question is how these tankers, Russian tankers, are avoiding being tracked by someone.
So there's lots of different ways that the fleet can hide detection. They can turn off their AIS trackers. And if you look at, have you ever seen the sort of flight maps where you can see if your friend's on a plane, you can look at where all the planes are around the world?
Yes, absolutely.
It's kind of similar to that, but you can see the same thing with vessels all around the world. But you can turn off the tracking systems in a vessel, which basically makes it disappear. Also, what the Russians have been doing for years and years is to change ownerships of these ships. So, for example, a ship leaves a Russian port full of oil or grain or something like this, and it has a Russian flag with a Russian ownership because that's where it's left. At some point on its route, say to Singapore, say to Turkey, the ship will go dark and it will change ownership, the registry of the ship. And that means the ship appears as brand new on those tracking systems. So it has a new captain, technically, it has a new origin, it has a new name, it has a new purpose. And this is designed originally really for people to be able to buy vessels, or if a vessel goes bankrupt mid-route, someone can bail it out, someone can buy it, it can change ownership. But Russia kind of weaponized that system, that loophole, to make it appear like brand new ships are appearing on the ocean. And that's how they've managed to bypass detection in a lot of ways. Ship-to-ship transfers are another way that this is done. This is the third way. This is where 2 ships can pull up side by side and they can put a hose between them, literally 2 ships like this, and they can transfer all the oil. And that means the second ship, which might have left a different port, might have a different owner, might have a different flag, now carries the sanctioned Russian oil. But it's in a brand new ship, a ship that has no sanctions against it, and that can carry on. So there's loads of different ways that Russia can do this and has done it, but we still haven't really clamped down on it enough.
But how quickly all this flag changing or registration name changing happening? How fast it can be possibly happened?
Days. It takes about 48 hours minimum to have the new register set up. It's basically just like a new company, new shell company, a new name, a new owner.
But who approves the name changing? Who needs to be approved? Like, I'm changing the name. It should be somehow approved internationally, no?
Well, there's not really enough systems in place and regulations in place to have a one oversight body. Any country, I mean, the 3 biggest buyers of Russian oil are China, India, and Turkey. And, you know, you could have they could become the owners of the ship halfway through, and we don't have jurisdiction in those countries. So it's very easy to avoid detection, but we can still stop it.
in your documentary, you have spoken with the EU ambassador to Ukraine, and you were talking about the EU pressure to this shadow fleet, which were not enough, definitely. So how? Because as far as I understood from the movie, when you have the EU pushing pressure on the shadow fleet, then they're just changing allocation, running away like a cockroaches. No.
Yeah, the EU has done too little, too late. That's why Ukraine has had to blow these ships up in the Med and the Black Sea, which is completely justified.
Our own sanctions, as you said.
Yeah, Ukraine sanctions, which are far more effective than the EU's. So there's a huge amount of Russian money in Brussels and the EU Parliament. So we've just not clamped down on it enough. There's billions of dollars every single year to be made in servicing and allowing these ships to sail past our waters all across Europe. If you look at graphs in Germany, German companies that service these ships, companies in Cyprus, companies in Greece that service and maintain these ships. There's so much money in it that local politicians, regional politicians don't want to clamp down on it. So the only way it's really going to get sorted is if Ukraine carries on doing what it's been doing like this, which is great, and if the US now starts spotting these ships. And having a Russian flag on a oil tanker used to offer protection. Now it attracts attention. It has the complete opposite effect. And now all eyes are on these ships. So the whole thing could be shifting, which is very interesting because it's what pays for Russia's war machine.
That's a very good point. I've just seen the Wall Street Journal investigation when the journalists were saying that Russia hysterically trying to save the shadow fleet. Then that's why they're changing the flags into the Russian, because usually it's supposed to mean that the United States will not stop the tanker because it's connected to Russia. It has the Russian flag, and then you will not have any confrontation directly.
Yeah.
And now everything has changed.
Now it's the opposite. And this is going to be one point I haven't seen many people talk about is how expensive this is going to make it for the shadow fleet to exist. Russia in the last few days have started escorting some of their shadow fleet boats with military ships. And that is extremely expensive. To have your military babysit cargo ships is a huge amount of resources, but B, it means that those military ships are now busy. They can't be used for military operations. They can't be used for spying and espionage and the usual nonsense that Russia does. And the reason that these countries, Iran, Turkey, all of these different countries still buy Russian oil is because it's cheaper. And if it becomes more expensive for Russia to export their oil, then these countries aren't going to buy it because they won't get the same bargains, the same prices. And unfortunately, because most politicians around the world are morally bankrupt, markets matter more than morality. That's why these countries are buying Russian oil still. But as soon as it becomes more expensive, then they'll stop doing it. It's already expensive to do shadow shell companies. To change ownerships is an expensive and timely process. To do ship-to-ship transfers is expensive to get oil from one ship to another. If you have another layer where you've got to send military to escort these things, where you've got to find new loopholes, it's going to make the price of oil per barrel in those boats higher, and it will deter buying power.
Yeah, and speaking about that, another layer. In your movie, you use a strong phrase, oil is the bloodstream of the war machine. And I just want to know, if more tankers are detained, could this turn into real confrontation in the sea, or it's just happening right now already?
It already is a confrontation at the sea. Russia started that by doing sabotage, espionage, drone operations, launching drones from cargo ships into European countries, by severing undersea cables, by putting spies into Britain and different countries, by putting oil into a ship and stolen grain into a ship, and using that money to pay soldiers and launch missiles into Europe and into Ukraine, means that the shadow fleet has already escalated into a war machine, into a battlefield. Russia has brought the battlefield into the oceans. And it's not a question of if that's happened or not, it's how quickly and seriously we're going to respond to it and take it out. No Russian ship should be sailing anywhere near any of our countries. We can talk about international waters. We can talk about rule of law. Rule of law went in 2014 when Russia stole Crimea. Rule of law went when we rewarded Russia for its aggression in this country. So those rules are out the window. Now it's time to stop all of these ships, either seize them or sink them right now. And it would stop it straight away.
Sink them. I like that.
Yeah, they could be. I mean, they're pretty heavy. I think they go down pretty fast. It would put off a lot of people. And for people as well who say, you know, this would cause an environmental catastrophe. A, the ships that Ukraine have been hitting with their Baby C drones, they wait until they've already emptied their oil and they're on their way back, so they don't leak any oil into the ocean. And B, if you're worried about ecological disasters, the Shadow Fleet is the most aging ship population. The ships are completely deteriorated and aging. They're an absolute environmental hazard. And one day, if we could let this carry on, there's going to be an oil spill that will destroy maybe some of our prime beaches in Europe. So if you're worried about the environment, because I see people saying, Ukraine are blowing up oil ships, it's going to be an oil spill. There is going to be an oil spill, and it'll be a Russian ship into your holiday destination. So that's for that.
Yes, and you have spoken with Bill Broder, and the one that told you that the main customers of Russian oil, as you already mentioned, it's China, it's India, and the third place is Turkey. So speaking about Turkey, you know, it's interesting because this country is in NATO, not in the EU so far, but in NATO. How this country is capable to sit on two chairs, to pragmatically trade with the aggressor?
Because NATO is weak and pathetic right now. NATO should be turning around to Turkey and saying, if you continue to buy oil that is paying for an army to invade Europe, then we're going to kick you out of NATO, or we're going to start placing sanctions on you, or we're going to kick you out of every seat that we're associated with. That is what Turkey should be faced with right now. The last time I was in Istanbul a few months ago, there were direct flights to Moscow as well, flights to Sochi, and there were Russians arriving there, and it's their portal to Europe for their holiday destinations. And Turkey has been doing this the whole time. And Turkey say that this is trade. Oil isn't neutral. It's not trade, it's war. And they're paying for the war. Turkey are paying billions of dollars for the war, not just in Ukraine, but in Europe. When Russia launched 17 drones into Polish airspace, that violated NATO's airspace. Turkey paid for that. When Russia put a fighter jet over Estonia's airspace for 12 minutes last year, that violated NATO's airspace. NATO should have called up Erdogan and said, why the fuck are you buying Russian oil? And why are the drones that have been paid for it launching into our airspace? NATO need to get a backbone, and they need to make those calls immediately if they want to take this stuff seriously, or if they want to be taken seriously as an institution.
In your movie, I remember a sailor that you and him on the boat went somewhere in the sea, and you hid his face because he's kind of scared that somebody could track him and threaten and blow his boat or set it on fire, as you said. So who possibly could threaten him?
So it's an entire ecosystem. It's not one person. On all of these islands, there are ship workers, crew members, and people that make a lot of money from servicing these boats that I met. I went to different bars, different cafes in Lesbos, and I met a couple of people that had been living on these boats who were Greek, but they got offered lots of money. They had to go to Russia, get on the boat, and then they got off at Lesbos, and that's part of the journey of servicing. So there's a small economy on all of these islands that the local population all knows about, and there's a huge Russian presence on these islands because of that. And there's a huge amount of money in that. So no one wants to talk about it. No one wants to be ostracized. Whenever I approached any of the sailors and they said, and I told them that I was making a documentary about Russia's Shadow Fleet, they immediately hung up the phone because no one wanted to be associated with it. So, even being on these islands, if I was on this island for longer than a few weeks, I wouldn't be surprised if I started getting harassed or targeted by some of the Russians on these islands. I mean, this is a huge presence. Russians operate however the hell they want in Europe as well. We've seen this. They murder people whenever they want. They poison people whenever they want. They do spying, espionage. They murder journalists. They do this all the time. So, this is also why it's not really reported. There are two journalists who write for the local newspaper in Lesbos that I asked about this story, if they'd done anything about it, and they hadn't covered it, despite it being a huge part of the identity of Lesbos is servicing these ships. So, local press don't talk about it, local people don't talk about it, and that's why it was so difficult to get that footage. Even though this was happening 12 kilometers out, I thought we'd have to be going out hours and hours to find one of these ships. You only have to go about 20 minutes offshore. You can still see the luxury resorts where Europeans are sunbathing, and you can look to your left and see a ship that's carrying Russia's oil machine that's paying for a war a few hundred miles north in Ukraine. And it's so jarring, but that's why I went, because I really wanted people to see it and see how visceral it really is. And it looks so obvious. You see the ship, you can see the coasts, our European waters. These ships should be stormed, they should be seized, but we're too hesitant. And I really wanted to make that point. The vessel that went past was called the Tavorsky Bridge. It's an aging, old tanker. It's been running for a long time. But if you do research on it, there's countless websites showing that it's been sanctioned, showing that it's carrying illegal oil, sanctioned oil. but it still sails right past our waters. You could see it with a pair of binoculars when you're, on holiday. And that's what's so frustrating. Every single EU politician and every single local politician that allowed this to happen should be looked back on with outrage years from now. In future generations should say, how on earth did Europe allow this and pay for this? This is like the peak of World War II. Germany invading its neighbors and watching German warships pass by France and pass by holiday destinations across Europe at the same time. This would be exactly the same thing without any consequences. So that's why I went there, despite that risk, because I really wanted to show that thing, that very visual thing. And just how simple it is. This isn't an underground operation. These ships aren't hidden under the sea like submarines. They're just floating across the water.
During the Cold War, did Soviet Union use something like that, like right now with the Shadow Fleet, just using the sea and the oceans for their own purposes?
Yeah, I mean, this is nothing new. Russia has been using civilian cargo ships to launch its wars for about 80 years, since 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right.
Basically started when American reconnaissance drones spotted Russian civilian cargo ships carrying nuclear missiles to Cuba. And they were going to pull up in Cuba and they were building a military base there. And Russia's been doing this ever since. And for some reason, we've forgotten history. And for some reason, we pretended that it's no longer happening. But it's recent as well. In 2015, the Russians used civilian cargo ships to bring weapons and military, some chemical weapons, to the Tartus port in Syria to prop up the Assad regime. And these were chemical weapons that were used against rebels, against civilians as well, in cities like Duma that I visited, where people and children had burns all over their body. I mean, this is like horrific war crimes, and it was done using the ocean. So Russia has been doing this since the beginning with their cargo ships. And that's why every single Russian ship should be seen as a threat, every single one, despite how it's marked, because we've got records of this. This goes back almost 100 years. This goes back to the Cold War, and it goes right back up to 2026.
Do you think that the Shadow Fleet is a way of hybrid war of Russia against Europe and the whole West?
Yeah, I mean, Russia has been launching a hybrid war against the West for a very, very long time. They're using the ocean now more than ever. There have been cases, and Richard Holmes talked about this, who was in my documentary,
right,
of Russian spies that entered Britain using cargo ships and Russian cargo ships. Also Russians who are sailors who got onto other cargo ships to help service them, French cargo ships, German cargo ships, and entered the UK through ports without proper visa checks. So there are a million ways that Russia can mess with the West, severing cables, launching drones, committing espionage. There was a Russian ship last year that pointed lasers, very, very, very dangerous lasers at British military sites, at British military planes last year. Some of these ships have laboratories inside of them that are designed to do research onto the seabed to find weaknesses in cables, internet cables, electricity cables. These things are basically all warships. So this is a huge part of Russia's hybrid war. They have been doing this to us for a very, very long time.
If you would have a chance to spend just 1 minute in front of the European leaders in European Parliament, what would you say to them regarding this issue?
I would say, what the hell is going on here? No, but what are we doing? Because we are allowing ourselves to be invaded, terrorized, and we are allowing ourselves to be humiliated on the world stage by allowing a hostile nation to commit acts of war on us on a daily basis and do nothing about it. And also nothing about it matters so much because this could be so easily stopped. New policies, new sanctions within seconds. This is why it was really frustrating speaking to the ambassador, because I said, why is it too little too late? And she said it's because, well, there's bureaucracy, there are systems in place. Well, the systems in place need to go when there is a war being launched today. And I would say in the closing statements, you are at war whether you like it or not. Europe is already at war. And it's about whether you choose to fight back or not, and whether we choose to acknowledge that we're already at war and that there already is a hostile neighbor committing war against all of us right now. Today, there's evidence of this every single week. There's another event that happens, whether it's a drone incursion or an act of sabotage or an act of spying. Every single week, there's another event. Put it all together. We're already at war and it's time to fight back.
And another potentially decisive country right now is Iran. The protests are super huge. and the regime is reacting super heavily. People are captured. People have been murdered for just going to the streets, not even participating in the protests. So what is your take on that, what's happening in Iran right now?
What's happening in Iran is incredible right now. This is a completely organic, democratic uprising to a dictatorship. Most importantly, this didn't just start in the cities. This started in the rural regions of Iran, in the countryside, in the villages, all across Iran. If you look at a map, there are dots scattered everywhere. And that really shows this was a completely real and organic process. There's a lot of people right now who are saying, this is the CIA, this is Israel, this is just people that are aligned with the Iranian regime, this is just nonsense. This is people standing up to dictatorship, demanding freedom from an authoritarian regime backed by Russia in exactly the same way that Syrians demanded their independence. And again, the jubilation that I saw when I was in Damascus last year at New Year's Eve was unbelievable. Young and free Syrians celebrating after decades of occupation by a Russian-backed dictator. Fireworks in the sky, people celebrating all over the country. I mean, it was unbelievable. I've never seen anything so infectious in my life. And Iranians could be on the cusp of experiencing the same thing. But I think the most important part about it is that Iranians as a people are incredibly passionate. Most of my friends in London before I moved to Ukraine were Iranian human rights activists that had fled the country, that had carried on their work. Mariam Namasi, who's absolutely incredible, ex-Muslim, feminist woman who's just incredible. Some of the best entrepreneurs and business people in the West are Iranian. They just have this like fire and spark inside of them, which is why they're protesting so much right now. It's why Iranian food is so rich and full of spices and colorful. It's really like the soul of the people there. And they're not going to stand for bullshit anymore. They're not going to stand for being treated and being subjugated like that. And that's why so many of them are so bravely putting their lives at risk right now. And the internet is blacked out in Iran right now, totally blacked out. There are spots where you can get Starlink, where some Iranians are still making videos and they're saying, I'm defiantly protesting because we want freedom and democracy in our country. And it's amazing. And the implications for Russia, if that regime fall, are going to be drastic, because this is going to be nothing compared to Syria or Venezuela.
What kind of a misunderstanding in the Western media you see right now in the coverage of protests in Iran?
International media has had appalling coverage of what's happening in Iran, because a huge amount of our media and American media is corrupt. CNN have had a huge amount of money from Qatar. They've just opened a new headquarters in Doha. And when you have money from regimes in Qatar, if you have money from Middle Eastern countries flooding into American television networks, British networks, then you're going to start to see strange coverage from the Middle East. And I think that's why the BBC have put out headlines constantly in the last few days, quoting the Ayatollah, quoting the leader of Iran, and saying that these uprisings were to do with Israel and to do with the United States, a bit like people who say that Maidan was a CIA coup, which is complete nonsense, and siding with the Iranian regime. This is why independent media is so important. It's why this kind of show is so important. But what the media aren't talking about is the impact that this would have for Putin. The Iranian regime has already shipped a huge amount of its gold in the last few weeks to Moscow, because it's always about Moscow. That's where Assad fled. That's where Maduro was going to flee as his backup. That's where all the worst people, physical gold reserves, have now been moved to Moscow as a backup. Because that's where everyone goes when things get a little dicey. They go to their favorite hideout, Moscow. And if that regime falls, it would be a disaster for Putin. If you look at all of his friends and alliances over the last couple of years, you can cross off Assad, you can cross off Maduro. If you cross off Ayatollah, he's looking pretty much on his own. And that's incredibly, A, humiliating, but B, terrible for weapons in Russia. Russia are now manufacturing a lot of their own drones. But initially, a lot of the training and military personnel that were brought in to train the Russians on how to fly these drones was done by the Iranian military in Crimea in 2023. So there's been a huge military alliance and a huge military crossover. This is why Putin was so outraged when the Americans bombed the Iranian nuclear base last year. Do you remember when they hit with the bunker buster? Because that was their alliance. That was their stronghold. That was their partner. And Russia would lose a huge amount of influence and access. Iran is huge. It also gives them access to the Gulf, where they can have ships operating. They would lose that. If you look at a map, the Russians can go straight through Iran right down to the Persian Gulf. And so this would be catastrophic for them. They would lose more access to the sea like they did with Tartus. And again, to show how aligned this was, the Iranian regime wasn't just terrorizing its own civilians. They were terrorizing Ukrainians. That's why the drones that fly over the city every single night are called Shahed drones. That is an Iranian term. That is those are weapons designed and made by the Iranian regime, which is a terrorist regime.
So, if I'm understanding you correctly, if the Iranian regime will fall, they are approaching to that turning point, Russia will not send any Shahed drones. We will not see any Shahed drones?
No, because the Shaheeds are now made mostly in Russia now. Mm-hmm. But there's still a huge amount of military intelligence that's shared. There's still access to that sea. And there's still just a vast population that is arming and cooperating with Russia without any with complete impunity, and so that they would lose that, which would be devastating as well. I mean, the Iranian army right now, the military, they have a lot of resources, and they've been helping and assisting Russia since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And so it would be very, very damaging for Russia's ability to continue fighting a war. It wouldn't stop the war, but it would make it a lot more difficult. And it would just be another person that Putin wouldn't be able to call for support.
Yeah, so everything that's happening in Iran, it's going to matter far beyond its borders.
If the regime in Iran falls, it will be great for the planet, not just the Iranian people. It would be great for Europeans. It would be great for Ukrainians. It would be great for all the countries that that the Iranian regime has been waging hybrid war against and terrorizing. And that is, I mean, look at the drones that were launched over NATO's airspace last year were Shahed drones.
So are we witnessing the unraveling of the last remaining authoritarian alliance backed by Moscow?
The hardcore supporters, the superfans, are falling apart completely. And the only fans that are left are kind of like the ones that they don't really go to your concert, but they might like listen to the album every now and then, you know, China.
North Korea,
yeah, but they're not, you know, China are more interested in money than friendship. So if it really comes to it, you know, China would tell Russia, if Europe, which is a huge buyer of Chinese goods, turned around and really started putting pressure on China, they would probably side with Europe more than Russia. So the super fans, the hardcore ones, they're out completely, and that is a disaster. I mean, these are the people that Putin could rely on 100%. Doesn't have the same relationship with Z as he did with the Ayatollah.
Yeah, I saw Putin's plane just landed in North Korea, meeting with their leaders, Kim Jong-un. So I think that he's feeling a disaster in Iran.
Yeah, I mean, and if North Korea is your last
Not
friend...
a disaster. I just want to correct myself. It's not a disaster, as you said, for local people. It's just a disaster for the regime.
Yeah, I mean, he's scrambling right now to find the last remaining support that he has. He probably is watching every hour what is happening with these protests. He's probably sending weapons, whatever they have left, to Iran right now to try and suppress these protesters. I don't think it's going to work. I think that regime probably will fall. I have a very strange feeling about it. I haven't seen, it's actually not even a protest anymore. It's now an uprising. It's now a full-blown rebellion right now. It's shifted to that in the last few hours. And there's been 2,000 people killed, but people are going really hard on this. And really, if you have to fly to North Korea to see your last friend, I mean, this is a basket case. North Korea is not a serious country. You know, most of their countries in extreme poverty. They don't have a lot of resources. The main export of North Korea is basically money laundering and making fake dollar bills. It's literally one of their biggest industry. It's just like completely ridiculous country.
You know, the beginning of 2026 is really interesting, and it's only January. I don't know what's going to happen.
It's not even only January. It's like, what is it, the 12th? It's still the beginning of January. It's not even the second week.
I don't know what's going to happen next, but I hope it's going to happen, everything on Ukraine's favor.
It feels like it. This year feels different to the last few years. I don't know what it is. Not specifically in Ukraine, but everything around Ukraine, everything around Russia feels like it's more positive than I felt in a very, very long time. So something really great could be on the horizon.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you, Caolan, for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.